Soulslikes have been my favorite genre for a long time now. The combat, the gameplay, the bosses, especially the bosses, are the reasons why I keep replaying some of these games. However, recently there's been a lot of, hate towards the subgenre. It all kind of started a while back where you'll see a trailer for a game that obviously looked a bit inspired by the Souls series in terms of combat and some gameplay elements, but there will be people in the comments getting upset when other people start referring to that specific game as a Souls-like. And to be fair, I do understand that not because the game is difficult or put an emphasis on boss fights, that doesn't mean they're part of the genre. However, at the same time, you can't deny that some of these games, for example, Black Myth Wukong, aren't at least inspired by Souls. And speaking of Black Myth Wukong, it went through a whole process. When the game first released its gameplay trailer, most, if not all people had no issue referring to it as a Souls-like. However, closer to the release date, a lot of people were starting to say that it's not a Souls-like and it's more inspired by God of War. And most of this shift was, to be fair, caused by the devs because they're the ones that came out and said that. However, when the game finally dropped, a lot of people, including myself, saw that while it definitely took some inspiration from the newer God of War games, it still felt inspired by Souls, for the most part. Mostly because of the core combat and some other gameplay elements. Obviously, there are some differences like, different abilities and spells and the fact that you can only use one weapon, but again, at its core, it definitely felt like a Souls-like. Some may even say Souls-liked. And the reason why I brought this up is because it seems that most developers nowadays don't want to be associated with that term at all. They treat that shit like Voldemort's name. And it's not just game science. Many other devs with up-and-coming games have come out and tried to dismiss the Souls-like label. The creative director for Hell Is Us, which is an upcoming action-adventure game, even made sure he stated that the game isn't a Souls-like. But when you see the combat, you can tell that there were definitely some inspiration. Now it is understandable why someone would try to dismiss this, as this could potentially alienate a crowd of gamers who are more into casual stuff and associate the term Souls-like with challenging difficulty. So again, super understandable. But it kinda makes me respect the devs who wear their inspiration on their sleeves even more. Now, I'm getting a bit carried away, but there is something else that a lot of people who aren't super big fans of Souls-likes like to say, and that's, oh, there's just too many of them. I swear, every time there's a new hack and slash game getting announced, there's always a few comments dissing the Souls-like subgenre, saying stuff like, man, finally getting some real hack and slash games after being fed Souls-likes for years. And look, I get it. There hasn't been a lot of mainstream hack and slash games compared to back in the day, but there's also not a crazy amount of mainstream Souls-like games, excluding the actual Soulsborne ones. And I said mainstream. I'm not talking about small AA or indie titles. But all of this discourse made me ask myself this question. Are Souls-like starting to die down, and why are so many people more vocal about their dislike for the subgenre all of a sudden? Now at first it may seem like there's an abundance of Souls-likes. If we start from the first one, which is Lords of the Fallen, and count all the way up to today, there will be around 20 of them. But then you realize that a lot of the games in the genre aren't all that mainstream, and only a handful are. As you can see, there aren't a crazy amount of AAA or, well, in better terms, mainstream Souls-like titles, again excluding the actual Soulsborne games. So it's kind of weird when people keep acting like there's just thousands of them releasing each year. But don't get me wrong, I do know that the Souls-like style of gameplay is a bit of a trend that most devs hopped on, but my point still stands that there aren't as much as people make it out to be. So why are people getting tired of them? As I mentioned previously, one of the main reasons why people get tired of a genre is mostly because of quote-unquote oversaturation. However, there are a couple of other reasons why, and that has to do with the games themselves. In the beginning of the video, I've mentioned that I love the Souls-like genre a lot, and I still do, but there are clearly some issues with the games. Again, when I say Souls-like, I'm strictly referring to the subgenre, and not the actual Souls games. One reason why some people don't like the genre is because of the somewhat mediocre games that came out of it at first. I feel like a lot of the older Souls-like titles tried way too hard to emulate what actual FromSoft games were doing, and a big reason why a lot of them don't hit the same way as the actual Soulsborne titles is because they struggle with the core foundations that make these games great. The three most important things in a Souls-like are story/lore/world, the combat, and the boss fights. Unfortunately, most of these games miss the mark on at least one of these things, if not all of them, which makes most of them feel like weak imitations rather than solid experiences of their own. One of the biggest mistakes most Souls-likes makes is trying too hard to copy FromSoft storytelling without really understanding what makes it work. The Soulsborne games have deep layered worlds where the lore is revealed through item descriptions, cryptic dialogue and environmental storytelling. You're never given the full picture, but the world itself feels rich and alive because everything is carefully thought out. In a good Soulsborne game, even a random weapon or a hidden room can give you a deeper understanding of the setting and its history. Many Souls-likes try to do the same thing but miss a key step, actually making the lore interesting. Instead of crafting a world with meaningful history, they throw in vague, mysterious sounding dialogue and hope that players will just assume there's depth. The result is a setting that feels empty and unoriginal, rather than intriguing. It's like they're trying to be mysterious for the sake of it, rather than creating a story that players actually want to uncover. And oftentimes when they create a story, it's usually very bland and boring. However, there are some exceptions to this, of course, like Lies of P for example. Then there's gameplay and combat. If there's one thing that can make or break a Souls-like, it's how the game feels to play. A good Soulsborne style combat system should be challenging but responsive, rewarding players for precise timing, strategy, and adaptability. When it's done right, every attack, dodge, and parry feels smooth and intentional. But a lot of Souls-likes struggle to get this right. A common issue is sluggish and clunky movement where attacks feel like they take too long to come out, and dodging doesn't feel as tight as it should be. Lords of the Fallen is a good example of this. It has all the mechanics you'd expect, but something just feels off. The movement is stiff, hitboxes can feel weird at times, and enemies don't always react in a way that makes the fight feel satisfying. Instead of feeling like a tough but fair challenge, combat in these games often just feels frustrating. However, in recent times they've gotten a lot better, like again Lies of P, the Neo series, Black Myth Wukong, the Jedi series, and some of the upcoming games like Khazan has really great and responsive gameplay, so at least they're improving on this a lot. And finally, the bosses, arguably the most important part of any Souls-like, apart from the combat of course. FromSoft has mastered the art of designing bosses that feel both challenging and memorable. Yeah, sure, there's some dog shit ones here and there, but for the most part they're well designed. The best bosses aren't just tough enemies with big health bars. They have distinct movesets, unique designs, and a sense of spectacle. They force players to learn, adapt, and overcome obstacles in ways that feel rewarding. Most Souls-like games, however, don't manage to capture this magic. Instead of designing creative bosses with well thought out attack patterns, they tend to rely on artificial difficulty, giving bosses an absurd amount of health, making them hit way too hard, or spamming attacks that feel unfair rather than fun to overcome. Many of them also lack the sense of scale or personality that makes Soulsborne bosses so memorable. Instead of standing out, they just, feel like generic enemies with extra health, and that sucks. The problem with Soulslikes isn't that they exist, it's that they don't do enough to stand out. The best ones like Lies of P or Neo succeed because they take inspiration from the formula while adding their own unique spin. But too many just try to copy the surface level elements of Soulsborne games without understanding what actually makes them special. When they get the story, combat, and bosses wrong, they don't feel like great experiences, they just feel like games trying way too hard to be something they're not. And I feel like this is why some people can't get into them at all. But I don't want to leave a bad taste and say that, oh, all Souls-likes are bad. And because of this, I'm going to talk about some of the best ones, starting with Lies of P. Man, when talking about great Souls-likes, you have to mention this game. It basically nailed the core foundations really well. Now it's not perfect, but it's good enough to the point where it became the Souls-like game. What surprised me the most about Lies is the story and lore. For the first time in forever, a Souls-like actually made me give a shit about its story and world. First of all, they were off to a great start by using a fairy tale as the basis. Twisting the story of Pinocchio into this darker version in a different setting was a cool idea. I don't know, I just really like when movies and games do this for fairy tales. The entire time playing through the game, I was actually listening to the characters and the cutscenes, again due to how interesting it was. Now, I'm not saying that Lies of P has the greatest story ever, but again, it was genuinely interesting enough to keep me engaged. The rest of the stuff like combat and bosses were decent, even though I didn't like the parrying too much and I also felt like the dodge speed was a bit too stiff. But the game had some memorable bosses like King of Puppets, Luxasia, and Nameless Puppet. Even though those were the standouts, the rest were still decent for the most part. Overall, playing Lies of P was an incredible experience, and I can't wait for the DLC. The other Souls-like I enjoyed a lot was Black Myth Wukong. Just like Lies of P, the story was decent enough to keep me engaged as it's based off the popular story of Journey to the West. But what truly stood out to me was the combat. It felt quick and smooth, and you have all sorts of dope ass abilities which makes any fight feel engaging. And speaking of fights, the bosses were pretty decent as well for the most part, and the final one being my favorite Souls-like boss of all time. Again, this is just an amazing game. That's all I have to say. Now, what can the genre do to improve with upcoming games? Well, the answer is quite simple. Soulslikes just need to stop copying FromSoft without adding anything new. Stronger stories, smoother combat, and better bosses are the key to making the genre exciting again. Games like Lies of P and Black Myth Wukong prove it's possible, and new and upcoming games in the genre just need to innovate or at least heavily improve upon those issues. At the end of the day, Soulslikes aren't going anywhere, at least for right now. The genre isn't dying, it's just quote unquote oversaturated with games that just, don't quite get it right. When a Souls-like actually nails the core foundations, people love them. That just proves that there's still a huge audience for these games. The problem isn't that players are tired of the genre itself, it's that they're tired of half-baked copies. If new Souls-likes focus on meaningful storytelling, smooth combat, and great boss design, they'll stand out. The demand is still there. Developers just need to give players something worth getting excited about. Sure, there are some people out there that just doesn't like the Souls formula, and to be honest, that's okay. But again, I feel like if most Souls-likes fix those issues, then there wouldn't be a constant yearning for something new. And the final thing I wanted to say is, if the genre does die down, then that's completely normal. The gaming industry as a whole relies on trends, and if the quote-unquote trend shifts to something else in the future, then it's understandable why a specific subgenre will die down just at least a little bit. However, just like many things, it will always come back eventually.